What if a wild animal could remember you, not just your scent, but your soul? 5 years ago, Nathan saved a broken bobcat cub and made a promise he couldn't keep. Now, he's back, older, uncertain, and standing outside her enclosure with nothing but a memory and hope. Would she remember? Would she care? What unfolded next left even the scientists speechless and proved that some bonds aren't just instinct. There's something far deeper. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy the story, please like and follow. It helps us keep creating more. Your feedback means everything. Thank you. The mist rolled low through the trees, soft and silver, as Nathan Calloway pulled into the empty gravel lot of the Northern Pines Wildlife Reserve. His truck, an aging blue Chevy, rumbled to a stop, tires crunching over frostbitten stone. For a long moment, he just sat there, hands resting motionless on the steering wheel, watching his breath cloud the windshield. It had been 5 years. 5 years since he'd lifted a trembling bobcat cub out of a wire crate in Montana. 5 years since he'd whispered her name, Maple, for the crescent-shaped mark on her ear. 5 years since he'd promised he'd come visit once she was settled in the sanctuary. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Nathan glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. The reserve didn't open to the public for another 45 minutes. The forest around him was still and silent, except for the faint whistle of chickadees waking in the trees. Pines loomed like dark watchmen against a pale sky. He stepped out, pulling his coat tighter. Cold air bit through the flannel. The place hadn't changed, at least not from the photos. It was quiet, expansive, dignified. But Nathan had changed. The lines on his face ran deeper. His posture, once proud, carried a weight of regret. "Morning," a voice called from the path ahead. He turned to see a tall woman in a navy fleece and khaki pants striding toward him. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a tidy ponytail. She extended a gloved hand. "You must be Nathan. I'm Ruth Ellison." He shook her hand, nodding. "Thank you for meeting me early." "We're glad you came. I wasn't sure if you might change your mind." "I've tried to get here for 5 years," he said softly. "Nothing was going to stop me today." Ruth smiled, but her eyes were serious. "We've heard a lot about you, from the old transfer records. The man who raised Maple." Nathan looked away, throat tightening. "I just did what needed to be done." Not everyone would bottle feed a bobcat cub for 8 months, then let her go. He offered a faint smile. "I never really let her go." They walked together through the reserve, boots soft against the pine needle path. The trees parted ahead, revealing a wide enclosure bordered with tall mesh fencing. It looked more like a slice of wilderness than a cage, boulders, underbrush, and a stream flowing gently through one corner. "This is Maple's habitat," Ruth said, stopping beside the viewing platform. Nathan stepped closer, peering in. High above the ground, on a wooden platform, lay a creature both wild and familiar. Her fur gleamed golden brown, patterned in deep spots and streaks. She looked healthy, powerful, adult. But there, just visible through her ear tufts, was the crescent mark that had named her. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Ruth nodded. "One of our strongest residents. Calm, independent. You did good work with her." He swallowed hard. "I promised I'd visit." 5 years is a long time," Ruth said gently. "She may not remember." "I know," Nathan said, voice low. "I'm not here expecting anything. I just needed to see her. That's all." There was a silence between them, heavy but not unkind. Then Ruth said something he didn't expect. "We don't usually allow anyone inside the enclosures, but given your history and your credentials, we're making an exception. Would you like to go in?" Nathan looked up sharply. "Yes, absolutely." Ruth gave a small nod. "Then follow my lead." As she moved toward the gate, Nathan felt his heart pound, each step carrying him closer not just to a wild animal, but to a piece of himself he'd left behind. The gate clicked shut behind them. Inside Maple's enclosure, the world felt quieter, more alive. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Somewhere overhead, a raven cawed, its voice echoing through the dense trees. A stream trickled nearby, barely audible beneath Nathan's heartbeat, which thudded like a drum in his chest. Ruth led him a few paces in, then stopped by a wooden bench tucked against the base of a pine tree. "We'll sit here," she whispered. "No sudden movements. Don't look directly at her yet. Just be present." Nathan nodded, careful not to speak. They sat side by side, facing a clearing in the middle of the enclosure. At the far end, a series of platforms and logs created a vantage point 10 feet above the ground. That's where she was. Maple. She hadn't moved since they entered. Her body was still as stone, but her ears twitched forward, and her amber eyes locked onto them. She looked less like a memory now, and more like a sovereign, a creature who had learned to own her space. For several minutes, nothing happened. Nathan kept his hands on his knees, willing himself to stay calm. Maybe she won't come down, he thought. Maybe 5 years really is too long. He had read the research. Bobcats weren't like elephants. Their memory for people was short-lived, especially when the bond hadn't been reinforced. Still, it hurt. He glanced once toward Ruth. She gave the faintest shake of her head. Wait. The silence deepened. Maple's tail flicked, her head tilted ever so slightly. Then Nathan did something he hadn't planned, something from deep within muscle memory. He clicked his tongue twice. Click, click. A soft, subtle sound he used to make during feedings and calm check-ins. The sound had once meant safety. Maple's ears twitched again. Her gaze sharpened. Her entire body tensed, not with aggression, but alertness. And then she moved. With fluid grace, she stood, stretched her limbs like a waking cat, and descended the wooden platforms, step by cautious step. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Ruth tensed beside him, but said nothing. Maple walked toward them slowly, her body low, movements calculated. She stopped about 15 feet away, crouched in the underbrush, watching. "She's curious," Ruth whispered. "This is rare, very rare." Nathan didn't dare move. He barely breathed. Maple was stunning. Her coat thick and glossy, her paws silent against the pine needles. Her amber eyes seemed brighter than he remembered. And still, there was that crescent moon on her right ear. Then it happened. Maple made a sound, a soft chirp, high-pitched and brief. It was a vocalization Nathan hadn't heard in years. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a warning. It was something else. Ruth gasped. She chirped. Bobcats don't do that with strangers. That's a family sound. Nathan's throat tightened. Slowly, instinctively, he extended his right hand, palm down, not reaching, just offering his scent. Maple inched forward. 10 feet. 8. 5. And then, with a gentleness that defied her wild nature, she stepped into his space and pressed her forehead lightly against his fingers. Nathan's eyes filled with tears. "Hi, Maple," he whispered. "I missed you." Maple lingered, taking in his scent, then sat beside him, not close enough to touch again, but not retreating either. Ruth was speechless. "You were never forgotten," she said softly. "I've never seen her do this, not even with us." For the next 10 minutes, they sat in silence. Maple circled once, padded to the stream, then returned, always staying close, always watching Nathan. There was no fear, only recognition. When Ruth finally motioned it was time to go, Maple didn't resist. She watched them rise, then climbed back onto her platform with slow, deliberate movements. As they stepped through the gate, Nathan turned one last time. Maple looked down at him and chirped again. The frost had melted into soft earth by the time Nathan and Ruth returned to the main office. The chirp still echoed in Nathan's mind like a bell rung somewhere deep within his chest. Maple had remembered, against every expectation, against every logical argument, and somehow that changed everything. Ruth sat across from him at a small wooden table near the observation window, flipping open her logbook. "You know," she said, glancing up, "in 20 years working with wildcats, I've never seen a reintroduction like that. Not with a bobcat. Not after 5 years." Nathan gave a small nod. His hands were still trembling. "She used to chirp when I brought her breakfast," he said quietly. "I'd never heard that sound before I met her. I thought I imagined it meant something." "It does," Ruth replied. "It means she saw you as part of her circle, her kin, and she still does." Nathan stared out the window, eyes trailing the edge of the tree line. "I thought I failed her," he said. "I left. I broke a promise." "You gave her a chance to survive," Ruth corrected. "And from what I saw today, she never saw it as abandonment." That evening, Ruth invited Nathan to stay for the staff debrief, a modest circle of chairs around a fire pit near the central cabins. The sky had turned lavender, stars just beginning to prick through the twilight. Several caregivers, researchers, and a veterinary intern named Molly sat sipping tea from steel mugs, sharing notes from the day. Nathan listened quietly, absorbing everything: diets, enrichment schedules, injury updates. But when Ruth mentioned his visit with Maple, the circle leaned in. "She responded to his presence before he even made a sound," Ruth said. Then the chirp, clear and deliberate. He didn't approach. She came to him. One of the interns blinked. "That's remarkable. I've never seen a bobcat do that voluntarily." Ruth nodded. "It challenges what we know, or think we know, about long-term memory in solitary carnivores, especially those raised in transitional rehab environments." Nathan spoke up for the first time. "I kept thinking about her, even when I was in Arizona. Every time I saw pine trees or heard snow falling off a roof, but I thought I was just being sentimental, human." "You weren't wrong to feel that," Ruth said. "And maybe she felt it too." The next morning, Nathan returned to Maple's enclosure. This time, Ruth waited outside while he stepped in alone. He followed the same protocol: calm, still, no sudden moves. Maple was already at ground level. She didn't retreat. Instead, she watched him quietly, then circled once before padding to the bench where he sat and curling herself near the base of a tree, her back to him, but close. She stayed there for nearly an hour. No touch, no sound, just presence. Nathan didn't need more. When he stepped out, Ruth was waiting with a clipboard. "If you're open to it," she said, "I'd like to document this in a case study. We've had dozens of rescues, but none like this." Nathan hesitated. "You mean, turn this into research?" "Yes. for behavioral analysis, rehabilitation practices, long-term memory in wild felines, maybe even interspecies attachment models. Nathan nodded slowly. Then let's do it. If Maple's story can help others like her, it's worth it. Over the next few days, Nathan stayed on site. He helped with feedings, shadowed staff during behavioral observations, and sat quietly near Maple's enclosure each morning. Some days she greeted him with a chirp. Others she merely watched. But always she allowed him close. And always that crescent moon on her ear caught the light just the way it used to. 2 weeks later, Nathan stood in the center of the reserve's education hall, surrounded by photos of lynxes, cougars, and bobcats. On the whiteboard behind him, someone had written in thick marker, "Imprint or instinct. Case, Maple." He never thought he'd be here, presenting to a panel of wildlife specialists and behavioral researchers. Yet here he was, wearing a clean flannel shirt, a name badge that read Nathan Calloway, wildlife consultant, and holding a stack of observation logs. Across from him sat a dozen professionals, ethologists, sanctuary directors, 2 professors from McGill and UBC, and a wildlife journalist with a notebook already half full. Ruth introduced the session. We've long assumed that wildcats, especially solitary ones like bobcats, form short-term adaptive responses, not lasting emotional bonds. But Maple's case forces us to ask new questions. Nathan spoke next. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. I met Maple when she was 4 months old. She'd been sold illegally, fed canned dog food, and kept in a crate under fluorescent lights. I was supposed to stabilize her and pass her on, but she was broken, terrified, thin. She wouldn't eat unless I sat nearby, wouldn't sleep unless she heard my voice. He paused. So I stayed. For 8 months. He described the sound, the click, click. He used to calm her. The outdoor enclosure he built in the Rockies, the moment he let her go, and the years of silence that followed. Then he played a short clip recorded by Ruth. The moment Maple chirped. The gasp from the room was immediate, audible. "That's not defensive," said the professor from McGill. "That's affiliative." Another added, "It's comparable to maternal vocalizations in felids, and she initiated it?" Nathan nodded. Unprompted, after 5 years apart. The discussion that followed was electric. Some questioned the implications, what it meant for captive management, enrichment protocols, even reintroduction strategies. Others debated if Maple's response was memory or simply association, but all agreed something extraordinary had happened. Afterward, Nathan stepped outside for air. The sky above the pines was streaked with orange, a chill settling in for the night. Ruth joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "You handled that well," she said, passing him one. "I wasn't sure I belonged in there," he admitted. "You did, and so did Maple." They stood in silence, sipping slowly. Then Ruth spoke again, more cautiously. "We've been thinking. Maple won't ever be released into the wild. She's too human-imprinted, and frankly, too well-adjusted here. But if you're serious about staying on, we'd like to offer you a permanent position. Lead Wildlife Behavior Technician." Nathan blinked. "You want me here? Full-time?" "We've never had a human bobcat case like this," she said. "And more than that, you belong in this work. And I think Maple would agree." That night, Nathan didn't sleep in the visitors' quarters. He moved into a small staff cabin on the edge of the woods, close enough to see Maple's enclosure through the trees. The next morning, as he approached with a clipboard in one hand and breakfast meat in the other, Maple was already at the fence, waiting. No chirp this time, just a glance. Steady, warm, certain. And for Nathan, that was enough. Snow had returned to the forest. A light dusting clung to the pine branches and softened the footpaths around the reserve. The mornings came slow now, quiet, pale, full of breath you could see. From his cabin window, Nathan watched the landscape become still again, just as it had been that first morning he arrived. Only this time, he wasn't a visitor. He belonged. It had been almost a year since the chirp that changed everything. Since Maple reminded everyone, scientists, skeptics, even Nathan himself, that some bonds defy explanation. He'd settled into his role with quiet certainty, managing new rescues, mentoring interns, and continuing behavioral observation logs on Maple. Every entry carried a date. Every one of them began with her name. And yet, Nathan never forgot. Maple was still wild. She didn't greet him every morning. She didn't always come close. Some days, she stayed on her perch, ignoring him completely. But even in silence, there was presence, a rhythm, a trust. And when she did descend, when she circled him slowly or let her body brush lightly against his leg, those moments felt like gifts, not entitlements. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Nathan sat by the outer fence, watching Maple stalk a feathered lure through the underbrush. She leapt gracefully, her paws silent, her eyes locked. When she finally caught the lure and pinned it to the ground, she looked toward him briefly, not expecting applause, but sharing the moment. Ruth approached quietly, joining him at the observation post. She held a folded letter. "It's from the state board," she said. "They're asking about publishing the case study. Want to know if you'll co-author." Nathan exhaled. "I'm not a scientist." "You are now," she smiled. "Besides, it's your story too." He took the paper, reading the first few lines. His name. Maple's name. Recognition in a language that wasn't emotional, but official. It felt strange, yet deeply right. They stood in silence, watching as Maple disappeared into the thickets. "You ever think about what would have happened if she hadn't remembered you?" Ruth asked. "All the time," Nathan said. "But maybe that's the point. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about showing up." Ruth nodded. "Well, you did." In the weeks that followed, the reserve welcomed 3 new rescues, 2 lynxes, and a cougar kitten. Nathan oversaw their assessments, helping each animal adjust with the same patient, quiet presence he had offered Maple. And though none of them chirped, none of them leaned into his hand like she once had, he never compared. Maple was never his to keep. She was wild, and wild things, even when they trust you, never belong to you. One evening, he found her watching the sunset from her platform. The sky was molten orange, and her silhouette looked carved from flame. He clicked his tongue once, softly. She didn't move, but her tail flicked, just once, in acknowledgement. That was enough. Nathan turned back toward the trail, footsteps crunching lightly over snow, heart full. Behind him, Maple remained in place, untouched, untamed, and fiercely whole. And that, Nathan knew, was exactly how it should be.